Hello guys, so welcome to my academic tutorial for psychology. This will be the majority, if not everything you'll need for each component. Today we'll just start off with assumptions. It would roughly take around half an hour to do. You can put this on in the background if you're going to sleep or if you're going to anywhere really, for cooking, something like that. Just as a revision guide. You should always refer to your teachers to verify that the information here is up to date, as the spec can change. There we go. So here's the spec as you would have seen in your lessons. Behaviourist, biological, cognitive, positive, everything here that you'll be doing for component 1. So how it works is, I'll be giving you the knowledge you need for the exam. There'll be some extra stuff as well. So where in your paragraphs you will only need 1 or 2 examples, I might give like 2 or 3 or something like that. You can pick whichever one you need, really. Again, I should remind you, while this is a good revision tool to use, to verify everything with your teachers and, your class notes and whatnot. Exemplar answers, example questions will be in a separate video. But again, refer to your teacher for that. Exam technique is something realistically that you should be learning in class, so your teacher can read your work and whatnot. But I'll be doing my best to help you guys out. So the first assumption of the biological approach is localization of brain function. So this assumption suggests that behavior has a physiological cause, being the activity of individual parts of the brain. The brain is split into 2 hemispheres and 4 lobes that manage behavior. So these are the frontal, temporal, occipital, and the parietal lobe. The temporal lobe is the language center, Wernicke's area, which manages the understanding and production of comprehensible speech. The parietal lobe is the motor and somatosensory area, which is essentially just the link between the body and its senses and spatial interpretation. The occipital lobe is responsible for processing visual stimuli and passing conclusions to the parietal and temporal lobe. So the occipital lobe communicates with the optic nerve. So when you see something, optic nerve receives the information, and that communicates with the occipital lobe and other parts of the brain. The frontal lobe is an additional language center, which is referred to as Broca's area, which manages thought into speech and manages personality, planning, goals, and decisions. So examples you use in an exam or in an essay, realistically, an answer for this is only going to be 4 marks. So you will only need 1 example because you want to be spending 5 to 7 minutes max on a question like this. So, for example, damage to the temporal lobe associated with Wernicke's aphasia. Symptoms include the production of nonsense words, neologisms within the content of normal speech. Damage to the frontal lobe is implicated with personality change, seen in the case of Phineas Gage, where there was a penetration of his skull in the frontal area of the brain by a metal beam, which caused his personality to become more primal and aggressive. He was more harsh in speech, swore a lot, and less docile as a person. Damage to the hippocampus may induce anterograde amnesia. So this just refers to, as you can see later on in the paragraph, your long-term memory is permanently impaired, and you cannot make new memories and solidify them in your long-term memory. So you'll essentially be, every time your short-term memory runs out, you will revert back to prior the injury. So this is demonstrated in the case of HM. To cure his epilepsy, his hippocampus was removed. However, this causes memory to be restricted to short-term, lasting an approximate of 12 to 30 seconds. So the next biological assumption is neurotransmitters. So this assumption suggests that behavior is caused by electrical and chemical communications between neurons in the brain. Neurons pass messages to another via small gaps called the synapse. The chemicals between them are called neurotransmitters. They are released from presynaptic vesicles and stimulate or inhibit receptors, postsynaptic vesicles, in another neuron. So if you imagine a singular neuron in a brain, imagine 2 neurons. There's 1 neuron to the left, there's 1 neuron to the right. There are many neurons in the brain, approximately 100 billion neurons in a mature human brain. But imagine you have two. You have one to the left and one to the right. The one to the left is presynaptic. So imagine the word synapse meaning gap. Pre-gap, before gap. This releases a neurotransmitter, so a chemical signal to the next neuron, which is post-synaptic. So post meaning after the gap. The gap between them is obviously called a synapse. So this is why they're called presynaptic vesicles and postsynaptic vesicles. So in the postsynaptic vesicle, it either stimulates or inhibits receptors. So, for example, reduced levels of serotonin have been implicated in the etiology of depression and mood regulation. Excess levels of dopamine have been implicated in the etiology of schizophrenia. GABA is implicated in the process of sleep, sedation, relaxation, reduction of muscle intensity, and anxiety. Melatonin regulates sleep and wake cycles. So evolutionary psychology focuses on the process of humans becoming special animals and on the origins of why a behavior has occurred. Genes are passed down from one generation to another and are mixed from both parents to different families, resulting in genetic diversity, allowing for evolution and evolutionary change. Therefore, behavioral changes also occur. The process of natural selection means that behavioral traits that maximize the chances of survival will be passed down to a lower generation. This is reflected in the process of sexual selection, which was studied by a psychologist called Boss. Many other psychologists have studied it, but he's a prominent figure. A male's natural attraction to youthful skin and luscious hair may be a reflection of the subconscious desire for fertility in a female. This is because, generally speaking, a younger woman will have a higher likelihood of being able to get pregnant compared to an older woman as you approach menopause. However, obviously, realistically speaking, older women can still get pregnant. However, scientifically, it is much easier for younger women. So similarly, a female's attraction to a tall, muscular, masculine male may reflect the subconscious desire for dominance and the ability to provide for future offspring in a male. So a woman might look for security and a man to protect her, which is why these features would be attractive to her, according to Boss and other psychologists who study evolutionary influences. In this regard, there are both behaviors that both sexes exhibit to attract the opposite sex. For example, an ostrich using an example from the animal kingdom, an ostrich may dance to attract a mate. A peacock may fan out and rattle its feathers. Likewise, a male may show an expensive asset of theirs, wear clothes that reveal a muscular frame. A woman may wear more revealing clothing or apply lipstick and other forms of makeup. So moving on to the behaviourist approach, blank slate. So behaviourists suggest that behaviour is environmentally determined, that biology has no influence. Tabula rasa, the blank slate approach, suggests that humans are born as a blank slate, almost completely neutral with only basic instinctual behaviours such as hunger, crying and pain. Their behaviour will ultimately be moulded by the environment. This was defined by Watson, who stated that he could develop a dozen infants into any type of specialist. So it's important when you're writing your answers that you use these key terms such as environmentally determined, tabula rasa, blank slate, almost completely neutral, basic instinctual behaviours, and then giving the examples. These are key terms that you should use to pick up marks. So the example for this is a piece of research conducted by Bandura. So the sample size was 72 children split into 36 boys and 36 girls who were aged between 3 to 6. This was conducted at Stanford University Nursery School. So there were two groups of 24 and a control group. So an aggressive role model, which was somebody helping out Bandura. So they displayed aggressive behavior towards a Bobo doll. Once the children who observed that role model were allowed access to the Bobo doll, they replicated these aggressive behaviors. However, in the other group, the role model displayed non-aggressive behaviors to the Bobo doll. When the children were exposed to the Bobo doll, these behaviors were also replicated. So those children in the second group were not aggressive to the Bobo doll. So, to conclude, those with the aggressive role model exhibited far more imitative aggressive behaviors such as shouting and kicking. This suggests that behavior such as aggression is learned through the environment, through processes such as observational learning. So this supports the blank slate assumption, as both groups did not exhibit the same behaviors and the first group imitated the behavior of the aggressive role model. So this demonstrates the fact that behavior is learned from the environment, as prior to this the children did not have the capacity to display aggression, and they learned the behavior of aggression through observational learning by observing the role models. So this suggests that prior to this they were somewhat of a blank slate. So the next assumption for the behaviorist approach is conditioning. So this assumption assumes that behavior is split into two types: classical and operant conditioning. Classical conditioning is learned through association. Operant conditioning is learned through reinforcement, being the consequences of the past. So the process, in the exam you're going to have to explain the process of conditioning. So an unconditioned stimulus is presented to the human which elicits an unconditioned reaction. A neutral stimulus is presented in conjunction with the unconditioned stimulus. So after repeated exposure with both, the neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus, as eventually, once the human is presented with the neutral stimulus, they will react in the same way as they did with the unconditioned stimulus. So this is the example that is also in the classic research section of component 1 for the behaviorist approach. So Watson and Rayner's 1910 study conducted a controlled observation on a child dubbed with a pseudonym Little Albert. At 11 months old, they conducted a controlled observation on the child's behavioral reactions to various stimuli. A fear response was conditioned in cotton wool, a white rabbit, and seal fur, for instance. So the next assumption for the behaviorist approach is humans and animals learning in similar ways. So this suggests that humans and animals learn in similar ways due to our shared behavioral traits such as fear. This means that humans and animals go through the same processes of learning. Humans, like animals, have adapted to changes in our environment by using the same basic principle of learning as animals. It's important to reiterate though that, scientifically speaking, in your exam, regardless if you're religious or not, or follow a different set of beliefs, that you refer to humans as animals, but special animals. Humans are obviously different to other species of animals. However, scientifically, humans are still animals. It's important to remember that. We are not a separate biological entity. So an example for this is Pavlov's dogs. So these are examples of the use of classical conditioning in animals learning by association. An assistant would ring a bell before giving food to dogs. After repeated exposure to the joint stimuli, the dogs began to salivate when the bell was rung. This was applied to humans through the Little Albert experiment. So because we were able to use classical conditioning in both animals and humans, it demonstrates that humans and animals also learn in similar ways. So when you're writing, you need to expand in that capacity. So the next approach is psychodynamic assumption. So the next approach is the psychodynamic approach. The first assumption being the tripartite model of personalities. So Freud suggests that the human psyche is not a unified entity but three different parts. Our personality is split into the id, ego, and superego. So, the id is based on the pleasure principle, associated with impulsivity, the pursuit of instant gratification and self-service. The baby has it from birth. The energy of the id is called libido. The ego is based on the reality principle, which manages the competing demands of the id and the superego, developing from the age of 2. Finally, the superego is the morality principle. This learns to internalize parents' values and social standards, which internally rewards and punishes us for actions that oppose these values. It is the ideal force, the civilized, socially acceptable figure that the person strives to be. For example, a neurotic personality is developed when the superego dominates the id and the ego, whereas a psychotic personality is developed when the id dominates the ego and superego. This is characterized by impulsive and aggressive tendencies. So, the next assumption for the psychodynamic approach is childhood experiences. Freud suggests that our early childhood experiences shape our behavior as an adult. Fixations during childhood can influence our behaviors as an adult. Psychosexual development refers to a stage and age theory, that's a key term, which suggests that all children go through the same stages at roughly the same age, influenced by the location of libido, also known as instinct, in the child's body. So this is dependent on which body part gives the most unconscious pleasure at the time. So for instance, the oral stage is between 0 and 1.5 years old. Libido is focused in the mouth. The anal stage is between 1.5 and 3 years old, where libido is focused on the anus, and this is where potty training is crucial. The phallic stage is from 3 to 6 years old, where the libido is focused on the genitals, which results in an external immature interest in them. The latency stage is from 7 years old to puberty, and there is no focus on the libido in this instance. However, the genital stage is from puberty to adolescence, where the libido focuses on the genitals, which is internal and which is where your sexuality develops. So the next psychodynamic assumption is referred to the unconscious mind. The conscious is split into 3 sections that represent its depth: the conscious, pre-conscious, and the unconscious. The conscious is what we are currently aware of, rational and logical thoughts and perceptions. The pre-conscious is what we could be conscious of if there was thought applied to it, such as memories and knowledge. However, the unconscious are thoughts and feelings that are inaccessible to us. So this is an example for the unconscious mind. So ego defense mechanisms can explain behavior. When it cannot deal with the demands of our desires, the constraints of reality, and our own moral standards, people become anxious. Anxiety is an unpleasant inner state that people seek to avoid, and it acts as a signal to the ego that there is dysfunction somewhere. Ego defense mechanisms, coping mechanisms, are employed to ease these feelings, such as repression. So repression refers to where if you witness or experience a traumatic event, you may forget it. This does not mean that you are unable to remember it under any circumstance, but it means that it is pushed down from your pre-conscious or your conscious to your unconscious. So you are unable to remember it because it is in your unconscious. However, through things like therapy, through methods like therapy, a therapist may be able to bring that traumatic memory from your unconscious to your conscious. So you're able to desensitize yourself to the trauma, so you're able to effectively deal with it. So the first assumption for the positive approach is acknowledgement of free will. So this view and assumption, this assumption holds the view that we respond actively to the events around us. Individuals choose their own course of action and have absolute responsibility for their behavior. They are free from coercion and can choose any course of actions, undetermined by internal and external pressures. So the positive assumption is resistant to the concepts of biological and environmental determinism. This does not apply here. And they refer to humans, and they believe that humans are their own autonomous entities that can operate on their own will. So this assumption suggests that humans are in charge of their own emotions, are self-directive and adaptive. A good life can be obtained if we use our strengths and virtues to our advantage. Happiness is not as a result of determinism, but as a result of recognizing and developing our strengths to make our lives better. So for example, an example that you can use in your essay or 4-marker, Seligman and Diener in 2002 concluded that participants who had the strongest ties to family and friends reported lower levels of depression and other negative states. So this highlights that we are in control of our happiness and that humans have the free will to manipulate and put ourselves in a position to have a better psychological state. So this assumption argues that feelings of goodness and emotions are This assumption argues that feelings of goodness and emotions associated with positivity are just as valid as negative emotions. So Seligman and other positive psychologists argue that traditional psychologies have focused on the pathologies and disorders of psychology. Therapy is primarily argued to be focused on bringing people from feeling -n to 0. However, they should bring them to above 0. So if we take somebody seeking therapy for traumatic childhood experiences that have resulted in dysfunctional behaviors as they've grown up, if their starting point when they start therapy is represented by -n, as it's below 0, it's below a neutral point. However, therapy typically is argued to bring them from that negative state to a neutral one, rather than bringing them from a negative state to a positive state. So the positive assumption argues that our behavior is and can be explained by the fact that we are good and capable of goodness and excellence. This assumption suggests that we have signature strengths and that methods of social reintegration or programs may aid those who are psychologically disordered. So signature strengths can include things like courage, bravery, patience, etc. So the next assumption for the positive approach is focus on the good life. So Seligman distinguishes between 3 types of lives to live: the pleasant life, the good life, the meaningful life. The pleasant life refers to pursuing positive emotions and daily satisfaction. The good life is pursued by determining and developing signature strengths in our lives. The meaningful life refers to using our strength for a greater purpose. Seligman argues that there should be a focus on the good life, maintaining positive connections with others, having positive individual traits, and seeking life regulation activities. So the next approach is the cognitive approach, and the first assumption we will be doing is internal mental processes. So in this approach, cognitive psychologists see human beings as information processors, where essential cognitive processes all work together to enable us to make sense of and respond to the world around us. Some of the most well-studied cognitive processes include perception, attention, memory, and language. These assumptions all relate to each other and consistently work together to help individuals understand their environment. For example, to recognize a dog as a dog, we must pay attention to it, perceive its features, and search through our memory store to see if there is a match with something that we have already seen or experienced. To name it, we use our knowledge of language. These processes function within milliseconds to respond to our environment, which is known as information processing. The next cognitive assumption is the computer analogy. Cognitive psychologists often liken the human mind with a computer. They compare the intake of information to the input of a computer, the storage of such information with the processing of a computer, and the ability to recall such information as the output function of a computer. During the process stage, we use the cognitive processes of perception, attention, and memory. Therefore, the brain is compared to the hardware of a computer, and the cognitive processes with the computer software enable to make the computer run. Developed by Atkinson and Schifrin in 1968, the multi-store model of memory is a model that demonstrates the functions of cognitive processes relative to the quote-unquote hardware of the brain, such as short-term memory and long-term memory. It proposes that information is input into the brain through the senses, being the eyes, hands, and ears, moving to short-term memory. This is then moved to long-term memory through maintenance rehearsal, and moved to long-term memory to short-term memory through retrieval, like a computer's hard drive to its RAM. So in order to understand this analogy, you need to understand a little bit about computers. So within a computer storage, there's the hard drive, and this permanently stores information that is downloaded to the computer. It is likened to our long-term memory. However, the RAM is only in use when information in the hard drive, so the infinitely storing piece of hardware in the computer, requires information to be retrieved from it and given to the RAM. So the RAM is essentially a computer's short-term memory and acts when the computer needs to retrieve a piece of information from the hard drive. So likewise, when we are retrieving information, we retrieve it from our long-term memory into our short-term memory, so we were able to output it, so present it in language or written text or anything of the sort. So short-term memory is proposed to be able to hold 7 plus or minus 2 items at once, with a maximum time of retention of 15 to 30 seconds, whereas long-term memory is proposed to be infinite in size and longevity. Short-term memory has 3 characteristics, being a limited capacity, a limited duration, and being encoding, which is primarily acoustic and even translates visual information into sounds. So this is a diagram of the multi-store model, which is created by Atkinson and Schifrin in 1968. So first you have a stimuli, sensory memory, so the eyes, etc. Next, attention is paid to the stimuli. This is then stored in short-term memory for 15 to 30 seconds. Then through maintenance rehearsal, it is then solidified in long-term memory. The retrieval is retrieved from the long-term memory to the short-term memory, and the arrows represent, in the short-term memory, you can forget through decay or a lack of maintenance rehearsal. You can also forget in your long-term memory through a lack of rehearsal or by external interference. However, generally speaking, your long-term memory is still infinite and lasts for an infinite amount of time. So the next assumption for the cognitive approach is schemas. So schemas refer to packets of information that we use to make sense of our environment. Schemas allow us to predict the outcomes of events so we can live functional lives. They prevent us from being overwhelmed by the vast information of the environment. They can be refined through further interaction with people and our environment. However, this does not mean that they necessarily represent reality. They are developed via social exchanges. This means that they may distort this information, as humans may select and interpret environmental stimuli using irrelevant schemas. This may explain inaccuracies in recollection, such as through eyewitness testimonies. So if you use irrelevant schemas and you develop improper schemas, if that may cause the development of inaccurate stereotypes, which may impact your recollection. So opening up a schema refers to our unwitting use of the information within it. For example, the burglar schema may be comprised as a male, young to middle-aged, and dressed in a balaclava. Schemas can present themselves in different types, such as event schemas known as scripts, or role schemas which tell us about different roles, such as, for example, being a nurse.